When Magnus Carlsen plays Alireza Firouzja, us regular mortals of the chess world stop, watch, and learn. What a matchup this was today at an ongoing freestyle GOAT chess challenge that is happening in Germany. 8 strongest players of the world facing each other in Chess 960, also known as Fischer Random Chess. And that is precisely what is making this format very exciting for us spectators to watch. Players have played rapid games to determine pairings of the classical time control, and today was the second game of the classical time controls. Magnus Carlsen strikes back after losing the first game against Alireza. Now for this video I will be going over the rapid game that decided the fate of the match pretty much. But first I want to mention this is a tiebreak game, 15 minutes plus 10 seconds for each move, alright, after exchanging punches in a classical time control. Now what a game this was. Let's jump right into it. First, let's get familiar with the position a little bit. Both knights here in the corner for both sides, so that usually indicates that the pawn from the other side will most likely start the game. Here Alireza opens with c4, immediately hitting this pawn on h7. Now that pawn has to be defended with move like knight f6, and now Alireza goes b4 to gain even more space on the queen side. Now already on the second move we have an inaccuracy, c5 played by Magnus Carlsen, and later on in the press conference he actually admitted that this was too optimistic, a little bit of a silly idea to go for the pawn grab immediately. Well, it's not a pawn grab, but after h2, if g2 would have been captured on the board, then it would have been a pawn grab. Now c5, b takes c5, queen takes h2. Already we have a fist fight on the board, and that is precisely what makes this format exciting for players, I'm sure, and spectators as well. Queen takes h2 and g2 pawn is hanging, h1 knight is hanging. Now Alireza goes knight to f3, sacrificing the g2 pawn. As you may see, computer says that there might be a miss, and knight g3 might be even stronger. Now the idea of this move, knight g3, would be to locking this queen off, and after queen takes g2, knight goes to f3. Now bishops are gonna jump into the game, rook is ready to harass this queen, white is also ready to take complete control of the center with d4 and e4 moves. So I think white gets way too much initiative here for a sacrifice pawn, and as we are all aware, this is exactly Alireza's cup of tea. He enjoys playing with the initiative. So Alireza starts with knight f3 first. I'm assuming he thought that black was gonna go for the g2 pawn anyways, and either then knight g3 or rook g1. However, after a little bit of a thought here, Magnus realizes that is way too much initiative for white, so decides to return back to c7 to fight this monster center that white is about to get. So that's what happens anyways, d4, and black plays b6, trying to trade their side pawn for the central pawn. However, Alireza now goes e4, increasing space advantage by hitting in the center. B takes c5, e5, attacking the knight. If knight moves, h7 pawn will be hanging. If knight moves to g4, immediately there will be a double attack on the knight and the queen. So black will have to make an intermediate move, rook b8, Schwichenzug as it is called in German, and it's probably only fair that since tournament is played in Germany we mention it. Queen to d3, knight goes to g4. Knight will have to part ways for that h7 pawn, but obviously white does not want to take that pawn, since then center is about to collapse here. So white goes short castle, king safety first. Now if you're a little confused about how castling works in chess 960, you're not alone. I am too, but okay, when nothing's standing between king and the rook and neither of them have moved, then castling rules remain the same for all chess formats, I believe, including Fischer Random Chess 960. Now, c takes d4. Magnus later on also admitted that c takes d4 was way too much here. Move knight g6 had to be played to increase the pressure on this central e5 pawn and not allow getting your piece cut off the game. This knight, pretty much, as you can see here, it is quite tricky to commentate chess 960 as well. Now, queen takes d4. What does black do with this knight? If knight returns back to h6, then white brings their last minor piece in the game here with knight g3. Knight h5 will be a threat. Bishop h6 will be a threat. Then after bishop h6, knight jumps to f5. This is looking horrifying for black. I was thinking that probably h5 was gonna happen on the board during the game. After knight g3, maybe g6. However, white maintains a lot of pressure here. Moves like bishop f4, bishop b3, and then c5 screams to be played. So Magnus decides to challenge it with f5. And as we see on the clock here, he was not happy with his position. He had spent over 4 minutes thinking, well, about 4 minutes thinking on this move. He realized here that after en passant, knight will have to capture back and bishop f4 wins an exchange. Now, why wins an exchange? Because if black tries to block it with d6, then c5 comes, putting more pressure on this pin, open up the position entirely. Rook's gonna jump onto open files, e and d files. This is over. So Magnus decides to give up an exchange here with queen b7. Bishop takes b8, queen takes b8. Computer, the brutal force that it is suggesting not even to take this rook on b8 and play something like bishop c2, preparing rook b1, and talking about relative value of the pieces. Now, if black tries to maintain that rook, then knight jumps into the game. Again, this rook's gonna come onto open files, so white will maintain even bigger advantage. So bishop takes b8, I think understandable human move. You see the material, you cash in. Queen takes b8, bishop to c2, establishing coordination between rooks, getting the bishop into the game. Short castle from black as well, rook b1, putting the rook on the open file with the tempo. Queen goes to c7, and white brings last undeveloped piece into the game. Knight to g3, e6, an important move so that knight doesn't come to f5 and black opens up dark squares for the bishop here from e7. Knight goes to e4. I think a little bit of an inaccuracy here, as mentioned by the computer and later on in the press conference as well. Move like rook c1 and c5 would be preferred, but I think from a human perspective, it's very understandable to seek simplifications. Knight goes to e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop e7. This bishop is trying to get on this a7 g1 diagonal. Queen to d3. Here was probably the biggest chance in the game for white. Queen to e5. However, it's very tricky to see why black cannot play bishop d6, and in faster time control it's totally understandable. This trick, bishop h7, was overlooked. Queen h7, and then knight goes to g5, and queen h7 will be decisive on the next move. However, Alireza retreats queen back to d3, hitting the h7 pawn that way. Now g6 is forced, and then knight goes to d4. Now here Magnus makes a waiting move, a6, not to allow knight b5 basically, and we already see that practically here white is facing serious questions. How do you make progress? Computer is suggesting to return back to f3, but white had just moved knight from there, so I think no human does that. Now Alireza moves that knight to b3, which is inaccuracy according to the computer, because knight will be more useful on the king side rather than on the queen side, which I think makes sense. Knight goes to f7, and here is a very committal decision by Alireza, and he had spent about 2 minutes on this move when he only had 3 minutes left. All right, now it's clear that this knight wants to come to e5, then potentially may jump to g4, maybe bishop d6 if queen goes to g3. Clearly this didn't sit well with Alireza, so he decides to go f4, not to allow this knight to get active at all from e5. King goes to g7. Black is trying to consolidate. King goes to h1, moving away from this dangerous diagonal. Knight to d6, trying to liquidate a bishop with the knight. Also, maybe potentially knight f5, c5. As we see, this is an inaccuracy, and computer says that knight d2 would be preferred, but when you had a big advantage and you know you had the big advantage, and now you feel that it is dwindling, I totally see why Alireza is already looking for clarifications on the board. So forcing trades with c5, knight takes e4, queen takes e4, bishop goes to b7. Now this light squared bishop comes into the game with a lot of force. Queen goes to e5, white forces the queen trade. Queen takes e5, pawn takes e5. Now white is still an exchange up. However, black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, meaning that one pawn and a minor piece for a rook. And what is really important, I think, also is that white pawns are extremely vulnerable. So they will get attacked on the next moves. Rook c8, obviously black does not want to trade rooks. Rook goes to f4, bishop goes to d5, and rook b to f1. Now, white managed to do what they were looking for, consolidate the position while still maintaining an extra material. So instead of taking on c5, which Magnus later on called bailout into a draw, basically, or bailout into a safety, king g8 would have probably been better to maintain the tension on the board, and after rook f7, black can probably play rook e8 to defend this guy, and game continues, which would be playing in black's favor here, since white is very little on time, 1 minute versus 4 minutes. So practically I think keeping the tension would favor Magnus, would favor black. So he was a little upset later on with this move, bishop c5, but well, we'll see what happened in the game. So bishop takes c5. The strongest move here from white would be playing rook f7 check, and whenever king moves away, then going rook c1, forcing the trades here. Now rook f8 would be the most precise, because if bishop takes b3, a takes b3, and white maintains the pin on the c file, d7 is very weak. So rook to c1 was played immediately in the game. This was probably where Alireza could have improved his play. Having little time on the clock, he goes for the straightforward rook to c1 and allows bishop e3. Now black maintains a bishop pair, which with little time on the clock, and not only little time on the clock, but with the entire board open, bishop pair is definitely more powerful than rook and bishop versus two rooks. All right, so rook takes c8, bishop takes f4. Now the e5 pawn is also gonna drop. Rook d8, taking on e5, takes on d7. King goes to h6, so the h7 pawn is defended. Rook goes to a7, now trying to get that a pawn. Obviously black does not want to give up that pawn. Bishop c4. Now rook b7. Idea of rook b7 is they want to reroute the rook to either b6 and attack that pawn that way, or then to b4, attack the bishop and then attack this pawn from a4. Also, immediate knight c5 here would not be possible because of bishop d4. So rook b7, then bishop retreats back to d5. This is kinda indication that Magnus offers a draw here with bishop d5. If rook goes back to a7, most likely they would have repeated the moves. But Alireza does not want to repeat. He is going here for the win with rook b4. And rightly so. I think makes a lot of sense. Bishop c3, rook to a4. White has consolidated more or less, and now if they are able to grab that pawn on a6, then things are very much unclear here. Now, after a little bit of thought, Magnus decides to not play for the draw passively and instead chooses the most aggressive way to counterattack here. Try to run this pawn into the queen immediately. White grabs that pawn on a6, then that e4 pawn keeps running. Knight back to c1 to stop the pawn. e3, rook d6. I think this was the move that kept Alireza on his back feet for the rest of the game. If he had played, I believe, rook to a4 and then try to bring the king closer, let's say bishop d2, and knight goes to e2, and now this king will come to f1, and then move the rook away, try to push this pawn. I think if someone is having winning chances here, it would have been white. Instead, what Alireza plays, and I'm not sure if he missed, but most likely I think he missed this capture. Rook d6 drops the a2 pawn. That move was made quite fast, I would say, and I think he was a little low on time here, and that's what prompted him to move with the tempo here and drop the a2 pawn, a very important one. Now, computer says that do not take on a2, return back. But I think from human perspective, it's clear that white will be suffering for the draw till the rest of the game. So Alireza decides to, it's easier take on a2 and then try holding on one side of the board rather than against the bishop pair. Right now, objectively, this should be a draw, but with little time on the clock against the endgame virtuoso Magnus Carlsen, it is not going to be an easy task. Let's see now how Magnus converts rest of the game. I think a very instructive example of how to squeeze the water out of rock. Now bishop retreated back to c7. The chat was saying Alireza was fighting like a wounded animal still the rest of the game. Now we'll see if that was enough or not. There will be a lot of shuffling here. Basically, what adds to a defensive resource for white here is the fact that h1 square is a light square. It is an opposite colored bishop. All right, so when you have dark square bishop and the promotion square is a white square, then if king manages to get in the corner, and even if you have an extra piece, let's say this knight was traded for the g pawn and then king manages to get to h1, that would have been a theoretically drawn position. Now bishop d8 here, a little bit of dancing. Knight h7 is not a possibility because bishop e7 then would trap the knight, and now pawn is left on the g file. So knight retreats back to e4. There will be more jumping around with knight, bishop, and the king here. Knight tries to force these pawns to move forward. Knight h6 now, that he wants to trade on g4 if possible. Let's say if king goes to f4, then a very nice draw here would be g3. If you take king g3, then knight takes g4, and if king g4, king g2, and king is able to get in the corner. So that would have been a draw. So on knight h6, bishop to c5. White cannot force the matters. If knight g4, king takes g4, and then king is not able to get in the corner, because when we play g3, king g3, and you cannot cross the diagonal. All right, so knight returns back to g8. Now bishop e3. There will be more shuffling around. Knight attacks the h7 pawn. h6, knight h5, king to h4. Knight returns back. Now king g5. There will be more shuffling. Bishop d4, g3. As Peter Lego called it, this looked like a cemento. Cemento is basically a phrase for a fortress, which was very close, which Alireza was very close to achieving. As after king gets to g2, this knight can get back to f4 and then to h3. What a find for Alireza, and I 100% thought that this should be enough for a draw, because then knight can just keep going back and forth on f2 and h3, and black is not able to capture it, because if so, then pawn is left on the h5, this king will walk down to h1, and they manage to reach the theoretically drawn position. So knight to h3, king goes to e3. Now knight returns back to f2. There will be back and forth here on f2, h3, g5. I think most players had thought that this was the draw, and Alireza, I don't think he relaxes, but he probably thought that knight h3, knight f2 was enough for a draw. That being said, he goes back to h3. His best chance was probably here to go knight e6, and the point is that after king e4, this knight can go to g7, grab this pawn, and even if you trap that knight, then this knight can return to f4, and after trades, we are headed to a drawn pawn endgame. Unfortunately for him, he returns back to h3 thinking that this is probably still a draw, but man, these endgames are so tricky. Now, if knight goes, I guess, back to g5 and then h3, probably that would have been progress, but now knight goes back to f2, king goes to f5, then knight returns back to h5. Now there will be more shuffling here, and as we see in a minute here, after bishop e3, how does this knight make moves, basically? Now Alireza finds that even after knight f2 and trading this bishop for the knight, there's a very good chance that this still might be a draw, and it is a draw. Apparently king d2, king d4, king d2, and black is not able to make progress here. If king goes to c4, then king e3, and king is too fast going to grab those pawns. And now if black is being here greedy, it's gonna end up in a disaster, and white is the one actually who wins here now. So that would have been a draw, but after king e5, things are not as easy anymore, because if this knight returns back to h3, then king to e4, and now knight has no more moves, because if knight f2, bishop f2, and then king goes to d3, and if you play king h2, then king goes to f3, and white is in zugzwang. There are no good moves. So knight goes to d3. Knight would have to leave the safe shelter, basically, the king. And I think from here on, things become very tricky, because knight now would have to move around. And with seconds on the clock, I would say it's impossible to see which knight jump is correct and which is not. Now, computer says that knight b2 would still have very reasonable chances to hold the draw. However, it's not so clear. Bishop d4. Now, if you go knight d1, you are still here king d3, and you're gonna lose the knight. You have to go knight to c4, then bishop c5. Here, king d4. Still, this is going to be very tricky to hold. However, computer says it is still holdable. But knight b4 was the final mistake in the game. After knight b4, bishop to c5, this knight is not able to find the safe shelter, and it will have to keep running, and bishop and king will be able to surround it and win. Pretty much that's kind of what happened, because if you return knight back, then king to d3, knight e1, king e2, knight c2, king d2, and this knight is trapped. So knight gets on the run here on c6, but after a few more moves, as we see here, then bishop d4 check, Let's say if white moves away the king, then bishop back to b6, and knight is dominated, therefore will be lost, and white is not even close to grabbing black pawns here. So it is easily winning for black. What a game, and what a technique by Magnus. First, what a fight back in the opening position. I think that was very instructive, finding resources here, trying to pose opponents the most problems possible. I would say here, going f5, not going h5 and trying to defend passively, but choosing the most aggressive defense where he would have most chances of counter-attacking back. And once Alireza was not able to convert his extra exchange in the game in the most precise way, he was able to come back into the game. Later on, I'm gonna jump after traits here. Bishop b7. This is already an unclear end game, and the last decisive moment, I would say, in the game was when after c5, rook b to f1. Here we go, bishop to c5, rook f7. If Alireza had played rook f7, I don't think he would have lost this game, if not won the game, but most likely, probably, it would end up in a draw. After that, he was low on time, and this position, I think, is extremely difficult. The final miss was rook d6, here giving up the a2 pawn, and then basically white is doomed here to defending a very tricky endgame. So even on one side of the board, knight was not able to match up with the bishop. This shows, I think, and is a very illustrative example why bishop is a more powerful piece. Man, what a game. This was the game that broke Alireza in a match, and the next game Magnus was able to claim the match pretty comfortably and moves on to the next stage. Very close matchup by Alireza. He was this close to taking it over Magnus, but yet again Magnus emerges victorious, shows why he is the GOAT. Now, there are still more games to play in this tournament, but so far it's been a very exciting watch. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what do you think about the game, and I'll see you on the next one.